This is Financial Standard, the definitive source of news, thought leadership and analysis for Australian wealth management professionals. Financial Standard. Take the lead.
Hello and welcome back to the Financial Standard podcast. My name is Jamie Williamson and I will be your host for today's episode, in which we are going to take a deep dive into the topic of diversity, equity and inclusion. In 2022, the CFA Institute launched its Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Code for the investment profession. First launched in the US and Canada, it's since been rolled out in the UK. Earlier this year, we saw a European launch, and it's now made its way to Australia. To chat to me about the local launch and why DEI is so important, particularly in the field of investments, I'm joined today by Sarah Maynard. Sarah is the Global Senior Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the CFA Institute and is considered by many to be the foremost expert in this space. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. That's got a kind of daunting introduction, so I hope I live up to that one.
Sarah, tell us why CFA Societies Australia and CFA Institute have launched their DEI Code.
Sure. So I guess the sort of starting point is this is an initiative that's come from the industry for the industry. So, it's very much from a space where it's led by, a group of energetic advocates and champions who see the need. And that comes from the business of looking around and seeing who's missing, understanding that essentially the industry is set up to serve an increasingly diverse society, and that's true pretty much wherever you look in the world. And so how do we do that without being, fully representative and inclusive of that society? So that's a sort of starting point. CFA Institute and CFA Society Australia come into that because we work, sort of somewhat aligned with the industry. There are a lot of participants as volunteers from the industry, and because essentially we have a sort of long history of developing codes and standards for the industry, going back, pretty much 3 decades with the introduction of GIPS. And so, interestingly, some of the folks who supported that creation, the GIPS development, are also the people who called upon us to develop the DEI Code. And so essentially we've had some really influential investment leaders saying this is work that we should be doing in a very collaborative basis. And of course, I can say a lot more on the importance of the societies and that local knowledge and fully sort of focused national approach being very much part of it too.
Now, a lot of businesses are adopting DEI initiatives or policies these days, but what does this DEI code that other initiatives do that other initiatives don't do?
Well, some of that I just sort of touched on with the fact that CFA Institute it's not a regulator. Our codes are voluntary. But I think because we've got that infrastructure and understanding of codes and standards and how they can work, if you think about them and boil it down to their essentials, they're really about behavior change. So how do you enable organizations to have the right kinds of behaviors in the workplace? And this is obviously very much about the investment workplace. And so we're leveraging that existing experience that we have. And then I think also the other sort of big factor is the governance that we have. So I report to our CEO. I also report to our Board of Governors. We have a steering committee, again, some very senior folks involved in that with a really kind of global mindset. And we're increasingly adding into our subcommittees below that folks who have deep knowledge of multiple markets and multiple sort of specialisms across the whole industry. So I think that accountability, plus the fact that my work is also anchored with our research. So we try and do research, identify what the issue is, build advocacy around that, and out of that comes a standard. And so there's, typically I think, anyone who gets stuff done is standing on the shoulders of a lot of giants. And that's, absolutely the privilege that I have. So all of those sort of things come together in a way that where we're looking at this, but in a really holistic way across the industry. So DEI, how it fits in with the business and how also we've learned from the codes and standards we've developed in the past.
Okay, so Sarah, can you tell us a bit more about what's actually in the code?
Sure. So we have universal principles, 6 of them. And what we really tried to do was cover the investment professional life cycle. So we're looking at the first one, which is about expanding the pipeline. The second one is about talent acquisition, and the talent acquisition is across extending opportunities at all levels within the organisation. The third, and where we see a lot of potential benefit for the industry, is in promotion retention, because retention rates are not as we'd like them to be. And then the fourth one is leadership, and that can be everything from the most junior all the way up to the C-suite. Of course, it matters that we have C-suite engagement, it absolutely does, but there's a role for everyone. And then the fifth one is about influence, because we know that these organisations can be incredibly influential, and both in terms of how they allocate assets, but also how they work with other groups. And we've been sort of deep in the space of collaborating with other entities doing this kind of work. And then the sixth one is the holding to account piece. So it's the measurement. And that's where the data collection comes into play, and where we're going to be reporting on what we see is coming out of that data.
Now, you have some pretty significant signatories to the code internationally. We're talking major pension funds like CalPERS, CalSTRS, MassPrim. There's other early supporters that you've had, including State Street Global Advisors and Franklin Templeton. Why is it, do you think, that those signatories have gotten involved so far?
I think because they see the value of it for their businesses. So if you think about from the pension plan perspective, they have incredibly, diverse, essentially the pensioner base, their beneficiaries. Those are the folks who, have themselves very diverse backgrounds. So, if we think about, the Californian pension schemes, CalSTRS, all about teachers. Actually, there's a lot of women in that group. So they're actually looking into an industry that's serving the development of their end pension, but that doesn't really have that sort of gender representation. That's sort of one particular angle. I think also one of the things they've looked at is the way in which having diverse investment teams inclusively managed can really help in terms of really reaching better investment outcomes. Better and more inclusive workplace benefits everybody. So they've kind of walked that themselves, and therefore they're sort of really wanting to see that and develop that accountability with their managers. The Franklin Templeton sort of report, which is, in State Street, been phenomenal, represented on that steering committee, that governance I mentioned earlier. There, again, it's a business-centric reasons, and they're very conscious of what one of the numbers are described as the war for talent. How is this industry going to recruit, the most exceptional talent that it can to keep, delivering for clients? And actually, with that increasingly diverse society, again, across many markets, without being able to recruit from the widest group, then the industry is, going to struggle. So I think that it's understanding broader societal change and expectations, how those are developing, and then also thinking about what absolutely makes sense for those businesses. So there's again, a lot more to sort of unpick below that, but that's, I guess, the starting point.
You kind of already mentioned this, but obviously part of being a signatory is this commitment to progress reporting.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously mindful that the code is only introduced about 2 years ago, but what have you learned so far from that initial signatory reporting?
One of the themes that's emerging is, and this probably wouldn't come as a surprise because it's volunteer, therefore there's a self-selected bias here. Mm-hmm. But what we are seeing is that organisations that have made that commitment, and that won't have come from nothing. So they will have already been doing some degree of work. There's a variation. There's a broad range, but fundamentally, what we're seeing is that if we look into their investment teams, they would appear to be typically more diverse at this point than the investment industry as a whole. If we use CFA membership as a sort of prism, the lens through which to look at the industry, and we've got obviously the CFA Institute a lot of data on that. So that's sort of one point I think that's of very real interest. And then the other thing that's sort of emerging is the value of making this commitment in terms of the signal to the marketplace for talent. Even more perhaps than we initially hoped. And then the other piece is, that asset owner influence, and then the knock on to asset managers, and then really starting to see, the value of doing the work that essentially we set out in the code and the guidance.
Just finally, Sarah, What is next for this piece of work?
So it's going to keep evolving. And it's going to keep evolving with the signatories in a very collaborative way. So what we're really looking to provide is, support to advance and accelerate that change, but also some degree of challenge. And that's where the data collection really kind of helps to keep us all honest in terms of progress. And then the sort of geographical, if you like, development is we're going to be introducing the code in Singapore next month. So that's another exciting one to come, and then gradually rolling out. I've got a sort of queue, if you like, of other societies who are really keen to do this work, and then that means that over time we'll have something which is global because the principles are universal across markets, but has deep market understanding and knowledge. Really, thanks to the societies like the one here, led by Lisa, and the board. That. All that building on, say, back to the shoulders of giants, that's the piece that I think really matters and is another differentiator for us in this initiative.
Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. And obviously, congratulations again on the local launch of the DEI Code.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for listening to us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this Financial Standard podcast. For more information, visit financialstandard.com.au. Please keep in mind that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider personal circumstances. Reliance should not be placed on any content without further independent financial research and advice.